The silence in the Apostolic Palace was a manufactured thing, a heavy blanket woven from fear and old stone. It was not the quiet of contemplation, but the stillness of a predator holding its breath. Below, in the labyrinth of the archives, the air itself tasted of decaying leather and the iron tang of ink, a scent that for 7 centuries had smelled of power, but now reeked of a lie. The document lay open on the oak reading stand, not the original, but a meticulously transcript of treatise. Its title alone was an act of war, a discourse on the forgery. The words felt like heresy even to think. Cardinal, a man whose mind was a library of Greek philosophy and Roman law, traced the Latin script with a finger that trembled almost imperceptibly. He, a scholar, could not deny the cold, cutting logic of argument. The foundation of the temporal world, the legal bedrock upon which popes had claimed dominion over kings and empires, was being dismantled, not by a sword but by grammar. Before we uncover how one man's words could threaten an empire built on faith, consider subscribing. The full extent of this deception is a story that has been buried for centuries, and its unearthing will challenge everything you thought you knew about the rock upon which the church was built. Pushed back from the table, the scrape of the chair legs on the stone floor was a profane noise in the suffocating quiet. He had been summoned by the Pope's secretaries, men whose faces were masks of practiced neutrality, but whose eyes betrayed a panic he had not seen since the fall of Constantinople. The news had not come like a thunderclap, but like a poison seeping through the Vatican's stone veins. It arrived in whispers from Naples, from the court of King V of Aragon, Pope Eugene IV's most bitter rival. Was man? This was not merely an academic dispute. It was a dagger aimed at the Pope's throat, guided by a scholar's hand. He walked past shelves groaning under the weight of papal bulls, decretals, and letters bound in calfskin. Each one, in some way, owed its authority to the document now called a fraud, the donation of Constantine. The story was known to every cleric, every prince in Christendom. The first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great, cured of leprosy by Pope I, had in gratitude bequeathed the city of Rome and the entire Western Roman Empire to the papacy. It was the ultimate justification, the divine mandate for the Pope to be not just a spiritual leader but a worldly king. But treatise, which had now read 3 times, was devastating in its precision. He had not shouted about theology or faith. He had dissected the language, with the cold precision of a surgeon, pointed out the impossible. The document, supposedly written in the 4th century, was filled with anachronisms, linguistic ghosts from a future it could not have known. It used the word satrap in a way no 4th century Roman would. It referred to the temple in Jerusalem as being built of white marble, a detail from not the Bible, and a common medieval trope. Worst of all, it used barbarisms, vulgar Latin terms that would have made a clerk in Constantine's court blush with shame. The language was not the Latin of antiquity. It was the clumsy, evolving Latin of the 8th or 9th century, the era of Charlemagne, not Constantine. A young clerk, his face pale and slick with sweat, entered the chamber without knocking, a breach of protocol that spoke volumes. "Your Eminence," he stammered, bowing low. "The Holy Father, the consistory is being convened. They speak of the Inquisition." The word hung in the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. The Inquisition, the final, brutal answer to questions the Church could not afford to have asked. But how could they put grammar on trial? How could they burn a philological argument at the stake? Had done something unprecedented. He had turned the Church's own tools, its mastery of classical texts, its meticulous preservation of language, against itself. He had used the light of humanism to illuminate a darkness at the very heart of the Vatican's power. Looked back at the forbidden text on his desk. His most damning point, the one that made the cardinal's stomach clench, was the simplest. The donation used the word feudum, or fief, to describe the lands being granted. It was a feudal term, a concept that would not exist for another 400 years after Constantine's death. It was like finding a schematic for a steam engine in the scrolls of the Library of Alexandria. It was an impossibility that, once seen, could never be unseen. This was not a simple forgery. A simple forgery is a lie told once. This was a lie that had been lived for nearly 700 years. It had justified crusades, excommunications, the crowning of Holy Roman emperors, and the accumulation of vast territories that became the Papal States. To admit was right would be to admit that the Church's temporal authority was built on a fiction, a ghost story told to frighten kings into obedience. The implications were dizzying, threatening to unravel the entire tapestry of medieval Europe. Who was the true ruler of Rome, of Italy, of the West? If the foundation was a lie, what did that make the house built upon it? Messengers were already being dispatched, their horses thundering out of Rome under the cover of night. Not to Naples, not to. They were riding to the great monastic libraries, to the universities in Bologna and Paris. The order was simple: find every copy of treatise, seize them, suppress them. But the real command was unspoken, an undercurrent of desperate fear. Find a flaw in his argument. Find a single error, a misplaced citation, a misinterpretation of a single word that could be used to discredit him, to paint him as a bitter heretic in the pay of a rival king, rather than a scholar who had stumbled upon a terrifying truth. But deep down in the cold, logical part of his soul, knew they would find nothing. The truth had the unassailable weight of a mountain, had not merely attacked the Pope. He had held up a mirror to 7 centuries of history and revealed the face of a fraud. Now, the men who had profited from that fraud had to decide what to do with the man holding the mirror. And their methods for dealing with such men were well documented, written not on paper, but in blood and fire. The question was no longer whether it was right, but whether he would live long enough to see his truth acknowledged. The air in the Apostolic Consistory Hall was different from the dusty silence of the archives. It was a cold, living stillness, thick with the scent of beeswax, old incense, and the unspilled sweat of powerful men. Heavy tapestries depicting the triumphs of Peter absorbed the sound, leaving only the rustle of watered silk and the faint, dry rasp of parchment as Cardinal took his seat. The faces arrayed around the long table were like ancient Roman portraits carved from marble, each line etched by ambition and piety in equal measure. They were the princes of the Church, men who could steer the soul of Christendom, yet their eyes darted with the furtive energy of merchants whose prize ship was reported lost at sea. Pope Eugene IV entered not with a grand procession, but with the quiet intensity of a coming storm. A Venetian, he was a man forged in austerity and hardened by a decade of conflict, with the Council of Basel, with the family, with half the potentates of Italy. His face was gaunt, his gaze a physical force that pinned each cardinal to his chair. He did not sit at the head of the table. He stood, his white cassock a stark pillar against the crimson backdrop. "We are not here," the Pope began, his voice surprisingly soft, yet carrying the sharp edge of tempered steel, "to debate the scribblings of a Neapolitan sycophant." He did not look at the scholar, but his words felt directed at him. "We are here to discuss a disease, an infection of the pen that of Aragon uses to bleed us. He thinks to wound us with ink." A thick-necked man with the hands of a soldier, Cardinal, shifted in his seat. Once a physician, now the Pope's most formidable commander and administrator, saw the world not as a text to be interpreted, but as a body to be purged of its sickness. "Holiness," he rumbled, his voice a gravelly counterpoint to the Pope's sharpness, "a disease is not cured by argument, it is cut out, is not the sickness. He is merely the symptom, the weeping sore. The poison is in Naples." Pope Eugene's eyes narrowed. "And you would have me send your armies against Aragon over a pamphlet, to prove a liar by turning his patron city to rubble, would welcome such a war. It would make him a martyr and a prophet." The room was a pressure vessel of unspoken agreement. They all knew this. To respond with open force was to admit the wound was deep. They had to operate in the shadows, where the Church had always held its sharpest instruments. But how do you assassinate an idea? An idea, once written and read, takes on a life of its own, a ghost that cannot be garroted or poisoned. Before another cardinal could speak, the great doors of the hall opened a crack. A secretary, breathless and pale, in and knelt before the papal throne, extending a sealed letter. The breach of protocol was so profound that it silenced the room. The Pope took the letter, his long, pale fingers breaking the wax seal with a snap that echoed like a breaking bone. As he read, the cold anger on his face curdled into something far more dangerous, a glacial calm. He held the paper out. "From our nuncio in Florence," he said, the words falling like chips of ice. "Medici has received a copy. Is said to be having his scribes make more. They are discussing it in the Platonic Academy. They are not discussing its heresy. They are discussing its grammar." The word hung in the air, an obscenity, grammar. Not blasphemy, not apostasy. Felt a cold dread creep up his spine. This was the true danger he had foreseen. His argument was not spreading as a weapon for kings, but as an intellectual curiosity for scholars. It was being passed from humanist to humanist, from library to library, not as a declaration of war, but as a brilliant piece of textual criticism. It was becoming a truth for its own sake, detached from the political machinations of Naples. You could silence a king's pawn, but how could you silence the very intellectual movement the Church itself had patronized? Cardinal stood up, his great bulk casting a long shadow in the candlelight. "Then the method must be different," he declared. "If the Florentines see this as a scholarly game, we must show them the price for playing. The Inquisition has agents in Florence. We can find one of scribes, a public confession, a recantation extracted through persuasion. We remind them that some questions lead not to enlightenment, but to the stake." "And what will he confess to?" heard himself speak, his voice thin in the oppressive atmosphere. All eyes turned to him. That he a text discussing the use of the word feudum, that he admired the author's command of classical Latin. You cannot put a footnote on trial, Your Eminence. His face darkened with contempt. We are not putting a footnote on trial, we are putting the man on trial. We will find heresy in other works. We will find pride. We will find sin. We will build a cage of accusations around him, so strong that his arguments about grammar seem like the ravings of a condemned soul. We will discredit the author, and the work will die with his reputation. The brutal logic of it was undeniable. It was the Church's oldest and most effective weapon, not to fight the idea but to destroy the man who dared to think it. Isolate him, defame him, condemn him, make his name synonymous with heresy, and his every word becomes poison. Pope Eugene IV raised a hand, silencing. He walked slowly toward a window overlooking the city, his back to the cardinals. For a long moment he said nothing, watching the smoke rise from the countless hearths of Rome, a city he ruled by a right now being called a fiction. When he turned back, his face was a mask of implacable resolve. He did not look at the scholar. He did not look at the other cardinals, the politicians. His eyes found the enforcer. The Inquisition will proceed, the Pope stated, the words final, absolute. But Naples is beyond its reach for now, is shielded by the walls of thee and the hubris of his king. He paused, letting the weight of the problem settle in the room once more. However, a man cannot stay behind walls forever. He has a family in Rome, he has friends, he has vulnerabilities. It was not a command, it was a release, a chain being dropped from a beast that had been held in check, felt the temperature in the room plummet. They were moving beyond public trials and theological debates. The Pope's words were a quiet, terrible permission. See to it, Pope Eugene said, his voice now barely a whisper, yet it filled the vast hall. Make this problem disappear. I do not care to know the grammar of it. The crimson tapestries seemed to drink the light as the cardinals filed out, their faces unreadable, their silence a vow. Did not follow them. He remained for a long moment, watching the popes retreating back, the white cassock a disappearing ghost in the gloom of the Apostolic Palace. In the cardinal's mind, the pope's final words were not a whisper but a command echoing in the vault of a tomb. Make this problem disappear. Grammar was for scholars like men who lived in a world of pure, fragile ideas. This world was one of levers and fulcrums, of pressure points applied to the frail architecture of the human body and the human heart. He did not return to the archives or to a chapel. His carriage, its wheels grinding on the travertine, took him to his own palace near the Campo. It was a fortress of finance and influence. Its walls hung not with saints, but with Flemish maps detailing trade routes and military campaigns. His study smelled of Spanish leather, spiced wine, and the faint, metallic scent of the medical implements he still occasionally used, laid out on a velvet cloth like a surgeon's instruments for dissecting a kingdom. He did not send for a captain of the guard or a hooded assassin. He sent for a man named a proctor from the Roman Rota, the church's highest appellate court. Was not a large man. He was built of wire and parchment, with hands so pale and thin they seemed translucent, the blue veins like script under the skin. His function was to navigate the labyrinth of canon law, to find the legal justifications for acts of power. He was a weapon sheathed in jurisprudence. Entered without a sound, his black robes pooling around him on the marble floor. He stood before the cardinal's massive desk, his eyes fixed on the silver crucifix, never directly on's face. "You sent for me, your eminence." The voice was dry like the rustle of turning pages, did not rise. He swirled the dark wine in his goblet, watching the candlelight swim in its depths. "There is a scholar in Naples," he began, the name left unspoken, a pestilence not to be named aloud. "He has a mother. She lives on the Via." His expression did not change, but a flicker of understanding, cold and absolute, passed through his eyes. This was the terrain he knew best, the web of family, debt, and obligation that held Rome together. "I am to understand," the proctor said softly, "that the spiritual well-being of this woman has become a matter of pastoral concern." "Deep concern," affirmed, his voice a low growl. "Her late husband, Della, served the Curia. A review of his accounts is long overdue. There are discrepancies, missing tithes from a property near, an inheritance that was not properly probated through the ecclesiastical courts 20 years ago. These are old, tangled threads. I want you to start pulling them." The strategy was as elegant as it was cruel. There would be no overt threat, no blade in the night, just the slow, inexorable grinding of the bureaucratic machine. A summons, a property lien, an audit. A charge of contempt for failing to produce documents lost to time. Each step would be legally sound, procedurally correct, and utterly terrifying for an elderly woman alone. Each notice, sent by courier to Naples, would be a separate turn of the screw on her son. Gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow. A son's love for his mother is a powerful theological principle, your eminence. A son's duty to protect her from worldly troubles is even more so. It can be clarifying. "See that it is," said, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "I want to feel every summons, every seal, every thread of dispossession as if it were a brand on his own flesh. I want him to understand the cost of his grammar." The proctor retreated, a shadow dissolving back into the city's intricate darkness. Was left alone with his maps and his wine. He was not destroying a man, he was deconstructing his world. He was reminding that for all his brilliant command of classical Latin, his world was still held together by much older, cruder words. Debt, family, fear, and pain. How long could a man champion an abstract truth when its consequence was the destruction of the person who gave him life? 2 days later, the rain came. A cold, relentless Roman winter drizzle that turned the unpaved streets to mud and slicked the stones of the Via with a treacherous sheen. Della was mending a linen altar cloth by the weak light of a tallow candle when the pounding came at her door. It was not the knock of a neighbor. It was hard, official, impatient. She opened it to find 2 men in the dark livery of the Rhoda's bailiffs. They did not speak. One of them simply handed her a scroll, its parchment heavy and damp, sealed with the forbidding red wax of the apostolic courts. She took it, her hand trembling. The seal was an intricate knot of keys and swords that she did not understand but whose authority she felt in her bones. They left as silently as they had come. She closed the door, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. With unsteady fingers she broke the seal. The document unrolled with a sigh, revealing a wall of Latin text. It was written in a dense, impenetrable script, full of abbreviations and legal phrases that swam before her eyes. She could read, but this was a different language, a language of power designed to confuse and intimidate. She could only make out a few words: her late husband's name, the name of a vineyard she had forgotten they owned, and the words debitum and inquiry, debt, confiscation. The document did not feel like paper. It felt like a stone, a weight pressed upon her chest, cold and immense. She was not a scholar or a queen. She was a widow living on a small pension and the support of her son, a son who was hundreds of miles away serving a foreign king. She sank into a chair, the scroll lying open in her lap, the incomprehensible words, a death sentence she could not read but understood perfectly. This was not about a vineyard. This was a message for. And she, his mother, was the parchment on which it was being written. The cold from the parchment seemed to leach into his very bones. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the winter rain streaking the window panes, and everything to do with the absolute, indifferent power inked onto the page. She sat for a long time, the candle flame sputtering and dancing in a draught she couldn't feel, the legal Latin a swarm of black insects crawling over the name of a husband 20 years in his grave. She felt not anger, not even fear, but a profound and hollow sense of being unmade. This document, with its seals and its impenetrable script, was designed to tell her she did not truly own her home, her memories, or even her name. She was merely a custodial inconvenience in a legal matter far older and more important than her own life. 400 kilometers to the south, under the brilliant, unapologetic sun of Naples, her son held a different kind of scroll. Stood in the library of a cavern of light and air overlooking the glittering bay. The manuscript in his hands was a freshly acquired copy of Quintilian, its pages thin as moth wings, the Greek script a thing of crystalline perfection. Around him, the air hummed not with threats, but with the competitive energy of brilliant minds. His bitter rival at King's Court was holding forth near the portico, his voice a drone of self-satisfaction as he debated the merits of Livy's prose. Paid him no mind. He was invincible here. He was the king's intellectual champion, the man whose mind was the sharpest blade in its diplomatic arsenal. His treatise on the donation was more than a scholarly work. It was a siege weapon that had brought the walls of papal authority crashing down, at least in the minds of educated men. Here, in Naples, he was not a heretic. He was a hero. A servant entered the library, his sandals whispering on the tiled floor. He carried a small, travel-stained satchel, a letter maestro from Rome. Took the letter, recognizing his mother's frail, spidery handwriting. He broke the simple wax seal, a corner of his mouth turning up in a fond smile. He expected news of neighbors, complaints about the price of oil, prayers for his health. He found something else entirely. The letter was short, the words strangely formal, as if written under duress. She spoke of a visit from court officials, a matter concerning his late father's estate, a document she could not quite understand. She assured him it was surely a mistake, a clerical error that he, with his cleverness, could easily resolve. She did not ask for help. But the plea was there, screaming from the spaces between the carefully chosen words, in the slight tremble of the ink where her hand had faltered. Debitum. The words from his mother's letter were not the common Latin of the street. They were the iron vocabulary of the Rota. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. This was no clerical error. Estate audits were the business of minor city magistrates, not the Pope's Supreme Court. He read the letter again, and this time he saw it for what it was, a meticulously constructed cage. She had been instructed, perhaps not even with words, to write this letter, to sound confused but not panicked, to present the problem as a puzzle for her brilliant son to solve, knowing he would see the teeth hidden in the legal verbiage. He walked out onto the sun-drenched terrace, the sea breeze doing nothing to cool the sudden fire in his veins, saw him and smirked. Troubling news. Perhaps your beloved Cicero has been proven a fraud as well. Ignored him. He looked across the bay toward the hazy silhouette of Vesuvius, a sleeping monster. He had prodded a monster of his own, and now it was stirring. But it had not struck at him, protected as he was by a king. It had coiled itself around the one person in the world he could not defend from a distance. They weren't attacking his logic or his research. They were attacking his blood. The sheer, primitive cruelty of it staggered him. It was an argument made not with syllogisms but with a mother's fear. For 2 days, he did nothing. He raged internally, composing devastating replies in his mind, letters that would flay the curia with the whip of his rhetoric. He imagined appealing to King, who would surely laugh at the Pope's crudeness and send a squadron of ships to blockade Ostia. But each imagined scenario crumbled into dust. An army could not fight a lawsuit. A king's decree could not halt a property seizure in a city he did not control. He was a master of a language that had conquered the world, yet he was helpless. The Rota spoke a different Latin, a tongue of pure, grinding power where truth was irrelevant and procedure was everything. On the 3rd day, a second letter arrived, this one not from his mother but from a cousin, a minor clerk in a Roman scriptorium. It was rushed, nearly illegible. It spoke of rumors in the courts. Della was to be formally evicted. Her pension from her husband's service had been suspended pending the investigation. She was accused of harboring a heretic's assets. The charge was absurd, but its purpose was clear. They were going to make his mother destitute. They were going to put her on the street, a public spectacle of the consequences of his work. The letter ended with a terrifying sentence. They say Cardinal himself has taken an interest in the case. The name landed like a stone. The butcher of Varna, the man who had financed his own armies, a cardinal who thought more like than a priest, knew then that this was not a warning shot. It was a death sentence, to be carried out not on his body, but on his mother's life. He went to the king, not in the sunlit library, but in his private study, a room filled with astrolabes and nautical charts. The king of Aragon and Naples listened patiently, his fingers steepled, his eyes sharp and assessing. He was a patron of scholars, but he was a monarch first. "This is the Pope's answer to your treatise," said when had finished, his voice calm, analytical. "It is clumsy, brutish, but not ineffective." "I need your help, your Majesty," pleaded, the scholar's pride stripped away, leaving only the raw fear of a son. "A letter from you, a diplomatic protest. Anything to show them she is under your protection." Rose and walked to a map of Italy pinned to the wall. He tapped his finger on Rome. "If I write a letter, I declare your mother an agent of my kingdom. I make her a legitimate military target in our dispute with Eugene. I might as well paint a Neapolitan flag on her door. It would give them the very excuse they need to arrest her for treason." The king turned from the map, his expression one of genuine, if pragmatic, regret. "They have put her in a place my armies cannot reach." She is not a combatant. She is a hostage. And the first rule of dealing with hostage takers is that you do not let them see how much the hostage means to you. The cold logic of it was a physical blow. The king was right. Any overt action from Naples would only escalate the danger, providing the legal pretext the Rota needed to move from civil procedure to criminal charges. The great protector, the patron who had lauded work and encouraged his attack on the papacy, was now telling him he was on his own. The king would not risk a war for a scholar's mother. Stumbled out of the study, the king's final words echoing in his ears. They wish to draw you back to Rome. Do not go. Your fight is here. This is a cruel test. You must prove your work is more important than your blood. He walked through the corridors of the castle, blind to the courtiers and the guards. More important than his blood. The entire purpose of his work, the foundation of humanism itself, was to celebrate the dignity and potential of mankind. And what was that if not blood? What was it but the love for a mother, the duty of a son? The Curia, in its brutal calculus, had found the flaw in his philosophy. They had discovered that a man who would die for an idea might be broken by the suffering of someone he loved. The choice they had given him was no choice at all. Abandon his mother, or abandon his life's work and walk into the arms of the Inquisition. He stood on the battlements, looking north toward Rome, a city he could no longer see as the heart of civilization, but only as a vast, intricate trap, with his mother bound as the bait. The sea below the battlements was a sheet of hammered gold, indifferent. Each wave that broke against the castle's foundations seemed to mock with its tireless, mindless strength. The king's logic was a perfect, unscalable wall of glass. He was right, of course. A monarch's calculus was cold, measuring lives against the stability of kingdoms, and in that equation, one old woman in Rome was a zero. But Della was not a zero to her son. She was the axiom from which his entire world was derived. He stayed on that parapet until the sun bled into the Tyrrhenian Sea, staining the water the color of swine. The wind grew teeth, cold and sharp, but he didn't feel it. He felt instead the phantom weight of the bailiff's seal in his mother's hand, the chill of the legal parchment against her skin. He had armed a king with a truth that could remake maps, and in return that truth had been turned into a garrote for his own family. He saw his rival, watching him from the courtyard below, a small, satisfied smile on his face. In the vicious ecosystem of the court, another's misfortune was a kind of nourishment. Back in Rome, the rain had not stopped. It fell for 3 days, a gray curtain that dissolved the world outside's window into a bleary watercolor of wet cobblestones and hunched shoulders. On the 4th day, the sky cleared, but the light that filled the street was weak and pale, the color of old bone. The knock came again. This time she did not hesitate. Dread had hollowed out all room for surprise. It was the same 2 men, their faces as blank and damp as the stone walls. Behind them stood a third, a notary with an ink pot chained to his belt and a stack of fresh parchment under his arm. He did not look at her, his eyes already sweeping the room, cataloging, assessing. By the authority of the Rota, the first bailiff intoned, the words worn smooth from use. We are here to compile an inventory of the assets of the estate of Della, pending resolution of the inquiry. They moved past her into the small home she had kept for 20 years. They worked with a quiet, obscene efficiency. The notary's pen scratched across the page, a sound like rats in the walls. One trestle table, oak, poor condition. 4 chairs mismatched. One crucifix, carved olive wood. They opened her linen chest, their rough fingers touching the dowry cloths she had embroidered as a girl. They lifted the small silver locket that held a miniature of her husband, weighed it in a palm, and noted its value as scrap. Each scratch of the pen was an act of erasure. They were not just listing objects. They were unmaking a life, reducing a home to a column of figures, a marriage to a disputed asset. Stood by the cold hearth, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She did not weep. She did not protest. She felt a strange, icy detachment, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. This was the language of power she had always known existed, but had never heard spoken so intimately. It was a language of quiet, procedural violence, where ruin arrived not with a shout, but with a form properly filled. When they finally left, the notary handed her a copy of the list. At the bottom was a sum, an appallingly small number that was meant to represent the total monetary value of her life with, and beside it, another date, the day of seizure. A week later, another letter, smuggled out of Rome by a sympathetic merchant, found its way to his desk in Naples. It was from the same cousin, his script now a frantic scrawl. It described the inventory. It told of how now sat in a nearly empty room, having sold what little she could to buy food, because her pension had been frozen. It spoke of the neighbors, who now crossed the street to avoid her, the papal summons having marked her door like the sign of the plague. Read the letter, and the world of light and learning, of classical debate and royal favor, simply ceased to exist. King's advice about the work being more important than blood now sounded like the prattling of an idiot. What was the dignity of man if it did not extend to one's own mother? What was the truth of a text if its discovery led to the public degradation of the person who gave you life? He saw it then, the perfect, diabolical architecture of Strap. It wasn't just about forcing him back to Rome. It was about forcing him to publicly choose. If he stayed in Naples, he was the monstrous son who abandoned his mother for fame and fortune. His name would be a curse in every marketplace in Italy. His scholarly enemies would have the ultimate weapon against him, not a flaw in his Latin, but a cancer in his character. If he returned to Rome, he would be swallowed by the Inquisition, his work discredited as the ravings of a desperate heretic trying to save his family. Either way, his work, his life's meaning, would be annihilated. One path destroyed the man, the other destroyed his legacy. For a day and a night, he did not eat or sleep. He paced the confines of his chambers, the Bay of Naples a torment of beauty outside his window. He had tried to fight the church with a quill, and they had answered with the full, crushing weight of their temporal power. His mind, the most celebrated intellectual instrument in Europe, felt like a child's toy. He picked up his own treatise, the elegant pages filled with his relentless, irrefutable logic, and it felt as useless as a book of poetry in a shipwreck. Logic could not stop a bailiff's knock. Grammar could not fill a starving mother's stomach. He had one weapon left, not logic, not truth, not the patronage of a king. The one thing he had that thought he did not, the capacity for total humiliation. He sat down at his desk, pushing aside the Greek manuscripts and the royal correspondence. He took a clean sheet of vellum, the kind reserved for official pronouncements. He dipped his pen, not in the dark iron gall ink of scholarship, but in the watered-down sepia of clerical letters. He held the quill poised over the page for a long time, the silence of the room absolute. The king had said, "Your work is more important than your blood." In that moment knew it was a lie. The work was an echo. The blood was the thing itself. He began to write. His hand, for the first time in his life, was not steady. The first words were not a defiant challenge to the Pope, nor a plea to King. They were not addressed to the community of scholars or to the judgment of history. He wrote directly to the pontifical chancellery, with a copy to be delivered into the hands of the most eminent cardinal. It began not with an argument, but with a confession. A full, groveling, and absolute recantation of his entire treatise on the donation of Constantine. He called his own work the product of youthful arrogance, a poison born of hubris, and a desire for secular favor. He praised the unimpeachable wisdom of the Holy See. He begged for paternal forgiveness for his grievous errors, which had so troubled the flock of Christ. Each word was a razor blade across the throat of his life's work. Each sentence was an act of intellectual suicide. He was dismantling himself, piece by piece, offering up his own soul not in exchange for his life, but for his mother's. The scratching of the nib on the vellum was the only sound, a dry, whispering surrender. He was giving the monster exactly what it wanted, hoping it would be sated by the meal and release the hostage. But as he wrote, a colder, more terrifying thought surfaced. What if this, too, was part of the plan? What if the purpose was not just to silence him, but to break him, to make him destroy himself, and then take his mother anyway? He folded the vellum before the ink was fully dry, smearing a line of his fealty to the Church, a fitting blemish on a perfect lie. The wax he used to seal it was not the proud crimson of his personal stamp, but a plain, anonymous brown, the color of dried blood. He did not call for the king's courier, a man who moved with the speed of statecraft. He found a common merchant rider, a man whose face was a map of tired roads, heading north with a cargo of silks and spices. He paid the man in silver, an amount that made his eyes widen. With a single this was to be delivered not to a secretary, but to the antechamber of the cardinal himself. As the rider galloped out of the castle gates, felt a part of his own history detach and ride away, shrinking into the dust. He had just mailed his own ghost to his enemies. The days that followed were a new kind of hell, a quiet, sunlit torture chamber. The once his sanctuary and intellectual arena became a place of unbearable noise and light. The endless chatter of poets debating the meter of Horace, the sharp clicks of chess pieces on marble boards, the bright laughter of courtiers, it all scraped against his nerves like a dull knife. He saw, watching him across the grand library, a look of predatory curiosity on his face, knew something was broken. He circled silence like a shark, sensing blood in the water, but not yet knowing the source of the wound. No longer had the heart for their venomous little jousts of wit. How could he argue the finer points of Ciceronian syntax when his mother was counting the days, until she was thrown onto the street? He had set fire to the entire architecture of his mind, and now he was expected to sit amongst the ashes and discuss the drapes. He stopped eating. Sleep was a shallow, feverish state populated by dreams of his mother's hands, blue with cold, reaching for him from a barred window. He would wake with the king's words echoing in the darkness. You must prove your work is more important than your blood. But the king was wrong. The work was a shadow cast by the blood. Without the source, the shadow was nothing. He had spent his life championing the glorious edifice of humanism, the idea that man was the measure of all things. Had simply handed him a measuring tape and told him to calculate the distance between his principles and his mother's suffering. The result had undone him. Nearly 3 weeks passed, an eternity spun from anxiety and sour wine. Then a message arrived. It was not a formal decree from the Rota. It was not a summons from the Inquisition. It was a thin slip of paper bearing the seal of a mid-level functionary in the Apostolic Camera. It was a receipt. It acknowledged, in bland clerical script, the reception of his petition and statement of clarification regarding his previous scholarly works. It informed him that his submission had been entered into the record and would be reviewed by the appropriate offices in due course. In due course. The two words were a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty. They were not an acceptance. They were not a rejection. They were a void. They told him that his grand gesture, his act of intellectual self-immolation, had been received with the same institutional enthusiasm as a request for new inkwells. He had confessed, recanted, groveled. He had handed them his soul on a platter, and they had simply filed it away. His mother remained in limbo, and he remained trapped, his sacrifice neither accepted nor refused. He was left dangling over the abyss, his enemies refusing even to acknowledge the rope he had offered them to hang him with. The true answer came 2 days later, again from his cousin in Rome. The letter was a whisper on paper, terrified and brief. The papal guards had been removed from his mother's street. The notice of seizure had been taken from her door, but she had received a new visitor, not a bailiff but a priest, an aide to cardinal. He had come bearing a gift, a basket of bread and figs, a small purse of coins. He had told that the Holy Father was merciful, that her son's case was being given charitable consideration. He had assured her that she would not be evicted. Not yet. She was, the priest had said with a thin smile, to remain in her home under the Church's gracious protection, while her son's contrition was fully assessed. Let the letter fall from his hands. It was so much worse than he had imagined. They hadn't ignored his recantation. They were using it. They had relieved the immediate pressure, the threat of homelessness, and replaced it with something infinitely more sinister. His mother was no longer a defendant in a property dispute. She was a ward of the state, a well-cared-for prisoner in her own home. The basket of figs was not an act of charity, it was a leash. They were demonstrating their absolute power, the power to threaten, to relent, to provide, to control every breath she took. They had not released their hostage. They had merely moved her to a more comfortable cell. The cousin's letter ended with the most chilling detail. The priest had asked his mother to write to her son. He had even offered to provide the paper and the courier. He suggested she tell of the Church's kindness, and to encourage him that a personal journey to Rome, to make his confession and receive absolution in person, would be the way to resolve this unfortunate matter for good. There it was, the final turn of the screw. They had taken his written surrender and deemed it insufficient. They wanted the spectacle. They wanted him on his knees in Rome. And they were now using his mother not as a passive victim, but as their active messenger, forcing her to be the one to lure her own son into the trap. The psychological perfection of it was breathtaking. He could now picture the scene. His mother, alone and terrified, trying to craft a letter that would both appease her captors and warn her son, her love for him twisted into a weapon against them both. King summoned him that evening. The news had reached the court, as all news eventually did. The king stood by a brazier, the flickering light making a mask of his face. "Your letter was a mistake," said, his voice devoid of pity. "It was a simple statement of fact. You showed them your throat. Now they will take their time bleeding you." "She is my mother," said, the words feeling hollow and useless. "And you are my sharpest weapon," the king countered, turning from the fire. "A weapon that has now deliberately blunted itself. What use is a recanted argument? You have not saved her. You have merely changed the nature of her cage and destroyed your own value in the process. Does not want your submission. He wants your annihilation. He wants every scholar in Europe to see the great, the slayer of the donation, crawling to Rome to kiss a ring. Your ideas are what he fears. And he has found a way to make you murder them yourself." The king's brutal honesty was a cold slap. He was right, had played directly into their hands. He had thought he was making a sacrifice, but he was merely performing the first act of a play they had written for him. He had abandoned the battlefield of logic, where he was a giant, and entered their arena of emotional blackmail, where he was a child. He walked from the royal chambers, leaving the king standing in the firelight. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of clarity that comes when every possible option has been exhausted and found wanting. He had tried reason. He had tried royal protection. He had tried surrender. Each had failed, each pulling the knot. He went not to his study, but to the stables. The air was thick with the scent of hay and horsehide. He found a groom and spoke in a low voice. He did not ask for the king's finest steed, a creature of speed and pedigree. He asked for a common pack mule, sturdy and unremarkable. He asked for a traveler's cloak, plain and coarse, the kind a merchant or a pilgrim might wear. He gathered no books, no papers. He took only the purse the king provided for his living expenses. As the first hint of dawn stained the sky over Vesuvius, the most celebrated scholar of his age slipped out of a side gate of the. He was not riding north to Rome to surrender. The time for surrender was over. And the Rhoda believed they had broken him, that they had reduced him to a choice between two forms of destruction. They thought they knew the game they were playing. They were wrong. A man who has already sacrificed his life's work has nothing left to lose, and a man with nothing left to lose is no longer a pawn. He is a weapon of a different kind. He did not know what he would do when he reached Rome, only that the man who arrived would not be the one they were expecting.